Hello, class. We're going to discuss the 1975 article, Beyond the Doubt of a Shadow by Todes and Daniels. Here are some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. Which four principles does Todes and Daniels 1975 initially introduce about shadows? 2. With which case does Todes and Daniels 1975 show that their principles lead to an apparent contradiction, i.e., the problem? 3. Which solution does Todes and Daniels 1975 present for their puzzle about shadows? 4. How might this metaphysical puzzle about shadows arise in a more practical context? Alright, as always, when you're watching this video, you may want to pause it so that you can take notes on the answers to the study guide questions that I provide in order. You could either write them down on a piece of paper in your notebook, or you could type them up, crochet them into a sweater. Anyway, this is a fun little puzzle. This paper is very short, as you probably noticed, just a few pages. And it's a little paper with a puzzle about shadows, right? If you're a metaphysician, you're interested in big questions, like whether there's anything more than atoms in the universe. But you're also interested in littler questions, like, are there such things as shadows? Do shadows exist? Or are shadows nothing at all? You might have this impulse to be like, I don't believe that shadows are things, man, because they're just not very serious, or they're not what an austere ontology would countenance. In any case, this is a fun little puzzle about shadows. The puzzle arises, well, first let me tell you the principles that Todes and Daniels share with us in order to then get us to think about this puzzle. Here are the principles. Principle number 1, an ownerless shadow cannot exist. In other words, if there's a shadow out there, then something must be casting it, right? It could be that there are occasions of darkness, maybe, but when we're talking about shadows, when there's a shadow, well, those are cast by things. Shadows are cast by illuminated objects, right? So no shadow can exist without an owner, right? That's the first principle. If there's a shadow out there, something is casting it. Principle number 2 says that an object cannot cast a shadow unless it's illuminated. That seems to make sense. In order for something to cast a shadow, it must have light shining on it, because isn't a shadow something like, when you block the light, it's the product of impeding light, so wouldn't a shadow require illumination? Seems so, and that's the second principle here. Second principle about shadows is that an object on which no light falls cannot cast a shadow. Now, the third rule is a little weird sounding, but if you give it a look with common sense, you'll probably assent to it. It just says that when shadows are cast upon surfaces, they do not go through those surfaces. They don't pass through and come out on the other side, right? If I cast a shadow upon a wall, we cannot expect that on the other side of the wall, lo, there's the shadow cast by me. That doesn't make any sense. Shadows do not go through opaque objects. That's principle number 3. And finally, we have this principle that says, if a shadow is cast by two things, A and B, right? If A and B cast a shadow together, then A must cast some of the shadow, and B must cast some of the shadow. That also seems to make sense, right? Think about how people might put their hands together in various ways to do shadow puppetry, and how their hands together cast a shadow. And in every case where their hands together cast a shadow that looks like a bunny rabbit or whatever, we can say that some of the shadow is cast by one of their hands, and some of the shadow is cast by the other hand. That seems to make sense. And to the extent that makes sense, so should principle number 4. Principle number 4 says that if A and B cast a shadow, if any two objects cast a shadow together, then some of that shadow is cast by one object, and some of that shadow is cast by the other object, right? There we go. So these are the 4 principles about shadows. We might call this shadowology or umbrology. I like the idea of umbrology, umbra being Latin for shadow, and fun fact, umbrella means little shadow. Isn't that cute, right? An umbrella is a little shadow. I love it. All right. Anyway, on to how these principles, seemingly plausible independently, can lead us into trouble. Here's how we get a puzzle out of this. Todes and Daniels call it the problematic case, or the problem. And you can see with a diagram it works like this. There's a light source. It's emitting light. And the light shines on a wall. Wall A. I'll say that the light shines on wall A. Wall A casts a shadow, which just so happens to perfectly coincide with wall B, so that every part of wall B that's facing the light source is covered by a shadow from wall A, and no shadow from wall A falls on any other thing other than just that section of wall B. So wall A falls perfect, the shadow of wall A falls perfectly on wall B, right? And then further out from the light source, there's a screen on which a shadow is cast, right? So here's the problem. There's a shadow there on the screen. According to our first principle, something must cast it. But it cannot be A that casts it, because if A were casting it, then A's shadow would have to travel through screen B, which according to principle 3 it cannot. And it cannot be wall B that casts the shadow on the screen, because in order for wall B to cast the shadow on the screen, wall B would have to be illuminated, which wall B is not, because wall B is entirely shaded by the shadow of wall A. So something casts the shadow on the screen, but it can't be wall A, and it can't be wall B. Well, maybe it's the two of them together. Maybe they cast the shadow as a team. But no, that would violate principle 4, where if A and B cast a shadow together, at least some of that shadow must be cast by one of them and not the other, and that wouldn't be the case. Indeed, in the paper, Todes and Daniels bring up fun examples where if you have light shining on a barn, and then there's a bunch of stuff going on inside of the barn, how much of that stuff going on inside of the barn actually contributes to the barn casting a shadow on the other side? You want to say none of it, right? As long as the barn is solid, right? So in that case, in the same way that you wouldn't say the stuff on the inside of the barn is responsible for the big barn's shadow, or the barn's big shadow, nor would you say that wall A gets in on the action when it comes to casting the shadow on the screen. So there we have it. There we have our 4 principles about shadows that seem pretty plausible, but then they lead to a puzzle. So what do we do? How do we get out? And here, I think the solution to the problem, or at least Todes and Daniels' solution to the problem, is not nearly as exciting or nearly as fun as the problem itself, right? The way that they solve the problem is they argue that the third principle is false. When you say a shadow cannot pass through an opaque object, they'll say, actually, it depends. If the opaque object in question is smaller than the illuminated one, then its shadow will sort of go around and envelop whatever shadow we would have worried about the opaque object casting, right? So they talk about overshadowing. So the idea is that if A were bigger than B, then, or if A's shadow enveloped B or is equal to it, then that counts as actually passing through the object, and that's okay, and that would be an exception to principle 3. It's only when the illuminated object is smaller than the object on which its shadow falls that it would be implausible to say that the shadow comes out on the other side, right? Like if you cast a shadow on a wall, intuitively you wouldn't think that that's, going to come out on the other side, even if the wall is casting a shadow. Likewise for anything that's going on in a barn, somehow contributing to the shadow that the barn casts on the outside in the sun, right? So Todes and Daniels say that the third principle is false. It's false that a shadow cannot be cast through an opaque object. Sometimes a shadow can be cast through an opaque object. It just needs to be a smaller opaque object. That's Todes and Daniels' solution to this puzzle about shadows. Now, real quick, you might wonder, why would this be something you think about, other than the fact that it's fun? And here's an interesting application of this puzzle, right? It's not about shadows, but it's about things being prevented, right? Preventing preventions. So Suppose you've got a trapeze artist who's falling, and beneath the trapeze artist, there's a safety net, A, and there's also a second safety net, B. So the second safety net will catch the falling trapeze artist in case the first safety net fails, right? So now let's suppose that both nets succeed and the trapeze artist falls. They land on net A. They're saved. But it seems weird to say that A saved the trapeze artist's life when the trapeze artist would have been fine anyway, right? Because of net B, the trapeze artist didn't need to worry about A being there. B would have caught the trapeze artist. There's a sense in which A didn't really do anything to save the trapeze artist's life, because even if it weren't there, it wouldn't have made a difference because of B, right? Meanwhile, it would be weird to say that B made the difference in saving the trapeze artist because the trapeze artist didn't even land on B, right? Is that slightly more interesting? Pretend that you're now insuring or selling those nets. Maybe you're selling net insurance. Now is that interesting? And there's maybe a practical application of this fun little puzzle about shadows. Thanks for watching. You're going to see more from me soon. Yeah, do your reading.